Hello, everybody. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm very happy to welcome you to today's program with Irena Klepfisz, celebrating her new collection, Her Birth and Later Years, New and Collected Poems, 1971 to 2021. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Workers' Circle Arbeiterring of Northern California, and our co-presenters, Congregation Sha'ar Zahav, the Jewish Folk Chorus of San Francisco, Claes California, and the Yiddish Theater Ensemble. And note that the Yiddish Theater Ensemble will be producing a play in August in Berkeley entitled Between Worlds, written by actress Naomi Newman and Zach Rogow, which is based on Irena Klepfish's life and poetry. And I'll post a link later in the chat to learn more. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library, who are our largest source of support for making what we do possible. I hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. Also, please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Also note that it will butcher any Yiddish words. It's really an extraordinary honor for me to welcome one of the writers I most admire. Irena Klepfisz has made an enormous impact. As one of the preeminent voices in the first wave of out lesbian writers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, as a political and social activist, as one of the foremost poets exploring the meaning of the past and Jewish identity, as a scholar helping to secure recognition of and appreciation for women writers, and in finding a place for Yiddish in contemporary American poetry. She was born in the Warsaw Ghetto and came to the United States at the age of 8. She earned her PhD at the University of Chicago and taught Jewish women's studies at Barnard College for 22 years and taught writing and literature at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for 10 years. But she's known to us foremost as a writer. Her books include 4 volumes of poetry and her prose collection, Dreams of an Insomniac, Jewish feminist essays, speeches, and diatribes. It has bothered me that most of her books have been out of print for a while, which is one of the reasons that I am so excited by this book, Her Birth and Later Years, which just came out several months ago from Wesleyan University Press and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. It's a place where virtually all of her poetry can be encountered, and it's an extraordinary book. Before turning it over to Irena, I'll first say that how we're going to do this is that since poetry can sometimes be overwhelming, she's going to read poems in clusters, and then we'll have the opportunity to pause for questions and answers. I'll ask 1 or 2, but I invite all of you to submit your own questions via the chat, and I can submit those to Irena. So Irena, it is now all yours.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very, very pleased to be here. The silver lining of Zooms is that, in fact, I can be in San Francisco while sitting in my Brooklyn loft. So I'm happy to see you all, and thank you for coming. The first quote cluster of poems I'm going to read is basically about the 3 most significant people in my life. The first one being my partner, Judith Waterman, who died 9 years ago this June. And the first poem I'm going to read is about her. The second poem I'm going to read about my father, and the third about my mother. So I'm going to begin with a poem that I wrote after Judy died. Judy owned a wonderful house upstate that we spent many, many years and time up there. And but she was very ill the last few years of her life. And so for 4 years, we were unable to go there. And it was sort of abandoned. And then the month after she died, I went up there for the first time in 4 years. The only thing you need to know about this is that I'm returning and that there's a reference here to something, a shrub called privets. I don't know how many people know what it is. It's just a common shrub, basically, but most people don't know the name. So this is called This House. After 4 years, I returned to this peace, this empty space with its paint-spattered floor, grateful that you let me in when you were so afraid another presence would overwhelm it. There are so many ghosts. You would be sad. Dave's mini market is gone, and so is the country store. Also the grocery in the next town, though the bagel place keeps on across the road from the Sunday flea market. I drove on the back road. It's paved now. Almost didn't recognize the hunting lodge 4 walls with a roof, and now a live-in house. That bicycle dangling from the tree above that silly pond, gone. The pig farmer's barn is locked. Remember those noisy little piglets, how he held them by their legs so we could see them up close? No trace of them, so freshly pink, running nowhere down the dirt path. And the woman with the goats, she's gone too, as is the flaming lavender trailer where 2 women lived, and we never did get beyond our own suspicions. For whom could we have asked? You knew the name of every insignificant road at every turn, and I'm trying to remember the routes and stop now at the place where you wanted me to cut some purple flowers, still wild blooming on a bank. Today, I placed a few in that small green vase. The truth, the house needs mending, so long neglected, it needs your care. I'm trying to channel you, repairing clapboards, the broken well cover, the broken steps. You may be gone, but are always with me. We're 2 ghosts, joined, and when I clear the roses, when I cut the strangling vines, I can hear you whisper, go help the privets, let the privets breathe. This next poem is quite almost 50 years old, I guess. I wrote it. I didn't know my father was killed when I was 2 years old, so I never really knew him. And my mother didn't like to talk very much about him. So over the years, I didn't really know very much about him. And in the 70s, I wrote this poem. It was called About My Father, in which I put in everything I knew about him at the time. And therefore it's called About My Father. He became a teetotaler out of his socialist convictions. During the war, he began to drink again. He was casual. He kept his tie in his pocket till the last minute before oral exams. He left me on the street to be picked up by the nuns from the orphanage. He watched me from a distant doorway. Once he refused to hit me. He told my mother his hand was too large. He wrote to his aunt that he hoped the baby would be a boy. When he was a student, Jews were not permitted to sit in the front rows of lecture halls. He made it a point to stand through the lectures. Ultimately, Jews were allowed to sit. He was a discus thrower. According to some, he got along with everyone, Jews, Goyim, children. He was caught a couple of times by the Germans. They thought he was a Polish smuggler. Once he was put on a train for Treblinka. He jumped, was shot at and wounded, but got back to Warsaw alive. He believed in resistance. This next, it's a series of poems. I'm not going to read all of them from a section called A Visit to a much larger poem called Glimpses of the Outside. And it was something I wrote when I started spending a lot of time in Judy's place upstate. And it was a real urban, it was like moving from downtown Brooklyn to a very, very rural setting. So it was a very different change in lifestyles. And of course, my mother came to visit. This village that we were in, you know, has a post office that's open for a few hours. There's an old cemetery that's, you know, really old, and a couple of houses. But when my mother came, she was just, to the degree that she was such a New Yorker, she asked me before, when we were driving towards the village, she said, is it a good neighborhood? Which is like what is sort of typical New York question, kind of. Anyway, she came the first time she came to visit, and we went, one of the things we did was go visit the Shaker Village, which is like close by in Pittsfield. So there's references to that. I'm not going to read all of the sections, but I'm going to read some of them. The woman who's coming to visit is my mother. Her life has been bracketed by historical events over which she had no control. During World War II, she developed a canniness for detecting Jews, did not care how many documents they had to prove who they were not. She knew, she could tell by a special look in their eyes, a gesture of the hand, a confidence too casual. This acquired ability, so finely tuned during the war years, remains alive, so that today, decades later, she cannot wander far from her Jewish neighborhood before she begins assessing who are the safe ones and who are not. Her survival, and as a result, mine, was partly dependent on her small nose, her gray eyes, and most critical, her impeccable Polish, with no trace of a Yiddish accent, because an older sister had insisted she attend Polish schools to gain greater mobility. It was one perspective on the Jewish condition in Poland. At critical moments, these elements, heredity and environment, combined in the right proportion to create luck. But there was also another, character, or in this case, guts. When the Germans came for her, she begged, "Ich habe ein kleines Kind." And when she saw the sliver of hesitation in their eyes, she ran and took her chances. They did not chase or shoot, just let her go. For months, she convinced peasants she was a Pole, playing a part, ad-libbing the dialogue without a flaw, pretending to be the human being they assumed she was. During this time, she learned survival depends on complete distrust. Even today, she is still fierce in her refusal to rely on others. Some would call it alienation, others pride. I think it's only the necessary stance of any survivor. History, she says with irony, has a way of repeating itself. Then she outwitted 2 German soldiers, probably young men taught from childhood the hideousness of Jews. Faced with a woman fair and ordinary, pleading for her sickly child who would be orphaned, they must have thought, no, this cannot be that Jewish monster. And she escaped, at least momentarily. Now she is trapped again, but no walls or barbed wire around her this time. No plans for uprisings or secret meetings. Each evening she returns, hurrying through the orderly streets, ominous in their emptiness, and steps into the elevator. I want to offer her advice, strategy, a philosophy, but know their utter uselessness in this age. For now is a vastly different time and place. The country is not occupied by strangers. Those she fears most are not an enemy, and neglect and hunger cannot be outwitted. We visit the Hancock Shaker village, walking through the restored buildings, recreated workrooms, and living quarters. I note the quietness, the simplicity of the line, and wonder about the eye that fashioned it, the aesthetic vision, the philosophy of light, air, of raising the struggle for survival above humiliation. We pass through the herb garden. My mother stops, looks in amazement at the round stone barn, and marvels how all this could have come to a dead stop without catastrophe, without disaster. She scrutinizes the photographs of children adopted and nurtured. How could they not have wanted children of their own, she asks, having always believed that one's own blood is the sole source of all security. And I see her shift as she tells me again of the children hidden in convents, baptized and converted, then claimed by relatives after the war. Many were finally kidnapped by their protectors, bribed, and bought off. Some could never be reclaimed. For those who were, it was hard, painful, but my mother adds, they were our only hope. My mother boards the train and sits behind the tinted glass. She mouths words and gestures, nothing I can understand. I raise my arms in frustration, motion her to try again. She does, but the barriers remain. She writes a note on a piece of paper, holds it against the glass. The European script is clear. It is empty here. It is cool. I smile and give the okay sign. She will be comfortable on her trip back to the city. Still, I am all anxiety. Departures swell old, undefined fears in me. The fear of permanent separations, old, long forgotten departures which remain active in me like instinct. The fear of being lost and never found, of losing all trace, all connections, severed, the thread broken. When after 2 years she came to get me from the orphanage, I cried when I caught sight of her and raised my arms to her. I was barely 3, but I had not forgotten. Of endless futile searches for relatives long vanished, or even worse, alive but not traceable. The train begins to move. My mother sits behind the tinted glass and waves. Her face becomes an angle and then disappears. Her words were, "Find a place where you are happy," but the sound of those words had the morning of separation.
Thank you so much. Oh, that was beautiful. Extremely powerful. So we're going to take a little pause, and I welcome anybody to put their questions in the chat, and I'll relay them to Irena. Maybe I'll begin with a question. For me, it was very striking hearing this house and about my father in succession. They were written decades apart. And you say in this house, you write, "You may be gone, but you're always with me." And it very much feel that feeling in talking about your father as well. There's a lot of loss in your poetry, and this house was part of a larger cycle of mourning for your longtime partner, Judy. And I wanted to ask whether you could talk about the experience of writing that and how it may also have related to your earlier writing on loss.
Well, it was, I wasn't very conscious of it when I first wrote the poem. It was a return. After 4 years, this house was very damaged, and Judy was very identified with the house. Judy was a painter. The cover of this book now, Her Birth and Later Years, has a painting with one of Judy's paintings on the cover, which I was very happy that we were able to, put on it and include it. And I think coming out of my background, as I do, coming out of the war, loss is always going to be an important theme in different ways. And in some ways, my father, who I never really knew, is always about loss because I never knew him. So he was somebody who was involved in the resistance, and he was very present publicly because in the community I grew up with, he was considered a kind of hero. But he was very conspicuously very absent in my life. As much as present as he was publicly, he was very absent with me. So I was very conscious about writing about absence and about loss. And my mother certainly was very, talking about her. At the time that I wrote the poem, she hadn't died at that, this was not a reflective poem, the poem A Visit. It was really written at the time that she had come up and visited us. But somehow there's, the past is what they say, the past is never the past. It's not even past. The past hasn't even passed. Sometimes people say that. And in some ways that's partly true. I think the trick is for it not to overwhelm the present and how to manage it kind of. I think that's what we kind of all try to learn to do, is to remember at the same time and not be overwhelmed by the memory or incapacitated, intimidated by it. So I think, and for me, I think writing about some things was also very a good way to do that, where you can memorialize at the same time that you're kind of very much in the present.
Thank you so much. So this relates to your father. Zach Rogow asks whether you can talk about the Bund and the role it played in your political and artistic development.
Well, the Bund is sort of my rock bottom. I sort of grew up, first of all, I didn't even know really what the Bund was, and I didn't realize that a lot of the conversations that I heard when I was growing up about the Jewish life in Warsaw of my mother's friends and my parents, that was the Bund. I thought it was originally just the Jewish life, but it turns out it was really just, it was the Bund. It took me a long time to realize that what I was listening to was really Bundist theories and Bundist life and Bundist activism, because they were all active people that I knew. Majority of them were very active before the war. And I was very taken with that. I was very, in some ways, I felt very envious of the life of life in interwar Poland, even though it was very difficult and it was growing fascism and anti-Semitism. There was a kind of energy that I really, really admired. And the Jewish Labor Bund was really the basis of that. And that continued during the war. I mean, there was, the Bund was active in the ZOB. I don't know how many people know that. It was the Jewish Fighters Organization, whose membership, my father was involved in that. And a lot of the people that I knew, like people like Vladka Mead and Bernard Goldstein, who have written well-known memoirs that have been translated into English, were all Bundists. But it was only when I became really an adult that I really had to first study about the Bund, because though I sort of knew all the principles, I really didn't know the history, because it was so, my education was so informal. I think I've always felt that whatever politics I had was the basis was socialism, Jewish secularism, Weltlichkeit, socialism, and as we say, in Gerangel, in struggle. And that was sort of my rock bottom, and I expanded on it. I mean, my parents certainly knew nothing about homophobia, trans people, queer people. That was alien. That was not even in their vocabulary. So I feel like I didn't give up on the Bund. I just expanded some of its principles.
Thanks so much. So I think we could go to the second group of poems, and then we'll have an opportunity for additional questions.
This unit is sort of about migration, and I sort of try to have minor themes. I'm not too theme oriented, but just sort of minor themes. Anyway, this is going to be partly about immigration and dislocation. And this first poem is a poem that I wrote when Judy and I would go to Maine for a vacation sometimes. We could not resist going into bookstores and libraries. It was like we didn't have enough books at home. So it was like, we were just compulsive. And we were in Brunswick, Maine, and we went to the local library. And this is a poem totally unexpected that I wrote as a result of that visit. It's called Grief, Brunswick Public Library, Maine. At the library, the woman with the broken English is broken, and so she wails, cracking the comforting silence. Everyone stops at the computers, along the orderly shelves, at the children's desk, where the papier-mâché animals seem to be drained of their colors, as if the sound had washed them in tears. She clutches a small girl and weeps, her arms tight around the child, while librarian tries to calm her. It's an old story. Her husband left, simply left, for the West Coast, for Singapore, Canada, for a job just down the highway in Harpswell. Perhaps she has no home to go to. Perhaps she'll kill herself and the child. She wails. The librarians huddle and call the police, and the police call for an ambulance. I think about the child, her fear, the father gone, and soon the mother too, for who will risk her with this woman? Who will risk the mother's pounding heart, her terror, her realization that she is alone on this unfathomable continent, in a library with so many atlases and answers, and not one to translate an abandoned woman awash in grief. I was 8 years old when I came to the United States. We had left Poland in 1946 and went to Sweden, where I was quite happy. We lived in this communal house. I went to Swedish school. I spoke Swedish, went to school on skis. It was really terrific. And then suddenly I found myself unhappily in northern Bronx, next to a park, but nothing compared to the rural landscape I had just left. So I was not, as they say, a happy camper. And this is called, this poem is partly about that, and it's called "The Old Poet Remembers the Immigrant Girl." From the start, the chorus always said, "We don't want what you have to give. We don't care who you are. You have to become different, change." When she first walked into class and pledged with the wrong hand, they all chorused. She stood mute, ashamed, as the teacher corrected her, still mute when they chorused the incomprehensible sounds. After a time, she understood that girls would talk behind her back about her ugly stockings, the bows in her hair, the braids too tightly braided. It was all noise and dust and cars and loneliness, a mother at work, a glass of milk, a sandwich waiting on the kitchen table. Everyone whispered she was no one's friend. They locked her in a closet until her mother came home and claimed her. She learned she would be outside, that people would stop speaking to her and not tell her that there were always a struggle to be in, which meant that someone always had to be out. She was dressed in humiliation, the homemade skirts by the mother who had no husband. Once in class, the teacher asked them to tell what their father did, and at her turn, she stood mute again because she could not bring herself to say, "He is dead. My father is dead. He has always been dead." The words were only sounds, for her memory was blank, but they were sounds she could not risk. So she stood mute again until the teacher asked, "Do you have a father?" And she shook her head in shame, in fear, and sat down. She learned nothing they wanted her to know, but everything else about being alone, about keeping it close to her heart, about silence, about how her own words rebounded in her silence, about how she could use them, but only if she remained on the outside. This last poem, I am very sad to say, is still relevant. I wish it weren't. This is a poem that I wrote in the very late 80s at the start of the first Intifada in Israel-Palestine. And one of the things I was thinking about at that time, I was very involved for a number of years with Women in Peace, especially with Women in Black and the Jewish Women's Committee to End the Occupation here in New York. And one of the things at the time, I was trying to recreate in my own mind what I was thinking at the time that the occupation of the 67 war, when the occupation started, what my state of mind was. Because I certainly at that moment, nobody anticipated anything about what the consequences of that war was. And so this is a poem that I wrote trying to reconstruct that period. I was in graduate school in 67. I was in Chicago, and I had a roommate, and I had two friends who had in fact been in the army just a couple of weeks earlier during the war. The war was very quick, as some of you probably remember. It was called the 6-Day War or the June War. And my friends were in the army, and they didn't have to cancel a planned trip to come and see me in Chicago. So they were visiting me right after the war ended. And at the same time, I don't know how many people, whether this was national news or not, there had been a terrible mass murder in Chicago. 7 nurses had been killed. And Richard Speck was, I guess he was known. They hadn't found who had done it yet. So everybody was very on edge, especially young women living alone. We were very warned. So that's sort of the background of this poem, which I'm writing at the end of the 80s, but it's called 67 Remembered. And it's for my friend Hannah. In 67, you visited with your sister. I was in Chicago. Richard Speck had just murdered 7 nurses. We were scared. The war was only a few days over, and everyone said how well you and Gita looked. Who would have thought you just come from a war-torn country, dressed chic in late 60s fashion, smiling, easy, relaxed, confident the worst was over. I still have the photographs. How different that war from that other in your life. Siberia, the Germans at your heels, your father chopping trees in the forest. You learned Russian in the street, spoke Yiddish at home, wrote Polish in the segregated schools. You were a linguist at 8, ready to master even more tongues for the sake of survival. But in 67, you'd already mastered it all. You were so relaxed, so easy. It was a joke, this war, despite the casualties. It was a joke how relaxed you were. And wasn't I too? Weren't we all? Didn't we all glow from it, our sense of power finally achieved, the quickness of the action, the biblical roots, and how we laughed over Egyptian shoes in the sand, how we laughed at another people's fear, as if fear was alien, as if we had known safety all our lives. In the West Bank, I don't remember it mentioned by any of us. We were in Chicago. It was hard to imagine. But 20 years later, I hear how they picked up what they could, placed it on their backs, how they marched through the hills, sparse, coarse grass, pink and yellow flowers, rough rocks defying cultivation, how they carried clumsy packs, clothing, utensils, images of a home they might never see again. As Sabra told me, who watched their leaving as she sat safe in an empty Jeep, it looked no different than the newsreels at school of French Belgian roads. It was simple, she said. People were fleeing, and we egged them on. Time passes, everything changes. We see things differently. In 67, you had not married yet, and we all wondered why, never worrying about marriage laws or rabbinic power. And now, more than 20 years later, you live in Jerusalem, ruling from your lacquered kitchen and sit in that dream house, trapped. Enough food in your mouth, in your children's, and enough warm things for winter, coats, shoes, woolen stockings, good for Siberia. And there's no way out, no one to call about a bad marriage. It's simple. A woman without bruises, your lawyer says, there's not much hope, and you accept it. I can't say I'm happy, but I've got a truce. Things fester. We compromise. We wake up, take new positions. We suit new visions, failed dreams. We change. Power does not so much corrupt as blur the edges, so we no longer feel the raw fear that pounds in the hearts of those trapped and helpless. In 67, in Chicago, we thought we'd be safe, locking the windows till Speck was caught. We did not know there was a danger in us as well, that we must remain vigilant and open, not to power, but to peace.
Thank you so much. Those are extraordinary as well. So I invite anybody to put their questions in the chat. I'll begin with one which is, in the old poet remember as the immigrant girl, you're clearly looking at your own experience. And then in that poem set in the library in Maine, you're looking at a drama unfold and you're focusing on the child. And it feels like with an empathy that derives from your own experience. And this is a big question, but I wanted to know whether you could talk a little about the impact of your childhood on your poetry and even your politics.
Well, I think one of the biggest impacts was actually the fact that I didn't like coming here. And I think the way I mainly expressed it was by really trying not to learn English. I was sort of on my fourth language by the time I got here, because I had spoken Polish. I understood Yiddish because it was spoken around me, but I never spoke it. And I had learned Swedish, and I spoke and read and wrote Swedish. And then I was pulled out of that, and I had to come here, and I was very unhappy. And English turned out to be my worst subject. But I was terrible in high school. It was really a problem, and it remained sort of a problem for me in college and in graduate school to some degree, that I could not totally grasp English grammar. And I think it was just psychological. I mean, I just couldn't do it. I didn't want to do it. But at the same time, I needed to express myself. And one of the things that I sort of, at the time when I was a teenager, which is when I started writing poetry, I thought that and nobody could tell you, if you wrote poetry, nobody could tell you anything was wrong. I mean, I could do anything I wanted. It could be ungrammatical, it could be misspelled, whatever. And so I turned to poetry as a sort of form of expression. I mean, it was sort of silly, and I wrote a lot of bad poetry for a pretty long time. But I think that's what happened, is that it was a way for me to sort of really, it wasn't even to tell the world, it was just to be able to articulate to myself. Because I'm a firm believer that writing poetry is very selfish to begin with, and then you maybe want to share it with the world, but it's a struggle within yourself to sort of know yourself a little bit better. And so I think that was I think that whole language issue was very profound. And also, it was also my resistance to really Yiddish was because I had had enough with languages. I mean, it was enough for me to try to master English without having to, this is, when my mother and I continued speaking Polish to each other late into my teens. So you have to imagine this. I'm coming here from Sweden. My mother immediately registers me in an English school. I don't know English. And she immediately registers me in a Yiddish school, which I understand, but I don't speak and I don't write and I don't know. And every time I come back from the English school and when I come back from the Yiddish school, I'm speaking Polish in the house. So it was a real linguistic mess. And for me, I think it wasn't helpful, let's put it that way. And it took me a long time to sort of master the English sentence. So from that point of view, I think it had the immigration had a profound effect on me linguistically. I think in terms of politics, I mean, I'm very hyper, I don't know if more than anybody else, but I'm so sensitive to anything about war and children and immigration and separation and all of that. I mean, it's a horror to me. It's just one of the horrors that people, I think, just don't understand, that it's a lifelong trauma. And I really got upset. I know everybody was upset. But the whole business with separating the children at the Mexican border, at the US-Mexican border, was just such a nightmare to sort of hear about. So I think politically, yeah, I'm not sure, to some degree, I've always felt like an immigrant. I don't know if you totally ever lose that. I think you forget it sometimes, and I think I forgot it actually for a long time until Trump came into office. And then suddenly I remembered, oh yeah, I'm an immigrant. I felt like I'm not a natural born citizen. And so you can forget about it. But then, my mother was just very, very secretive. She just never got over it. She didn't trust. And it's a real question about how much you do end up trusting and how much you should trust and how much you shouldn't, and so on. So it was I think it made an enormous impact on me.
Thank you. I have a sort of unrelated question, but especially as I see my former colleague Rose here. Most of your books are out of print, up to this point, and that's very much related to the fact that they were published primarily by small feminist publishing houses. And that age of feminist publishing and women's bookstores, I mean, that sort of golden age has passed. And I wanted to ask if you could reflect on the meaning of women's publishing houses and women's bookstores for you in your career.
Well, I mean, if you see my acknowledgements and at the end of the book, if you read my acknowledgements, I mean, my acknowledgements are totally to the feminist and lesbian feminist movements. I mean, that movement was the one that made my, if I can call it a career as a writer, possible. And it was really, some of it was self-made because we pretended we were presses when we were really self-publishing. And then we ended up publishing other people. I was involved in establishing a very, not huge, but a very influential magazine. I was a co-founder and co-editor of Conditions magazine, which was hugely influential. So I think, I don't think I would have had any kind of, I mean, people, a lot of my Yiddish poetry that people very much value, for example, my poem Bashert, which is very well known, the dedications to that poem are very well known. That was published in the Lesbian magazine originally. And Etliche Werte of Mama Lushin, for example, that poem was published in the Women's Review of Books. And my first book, Periods of Stress, was a collective that all of us got together, made up in the name of a press, and put our imprint on our books and said, oh, this is from Out and Out Books. The second book was from Keeper of Accounts. Different Enclosures in London was Only Women Press. And then a Few Words in the Mother Tongue, the collection that came out in '90, that was a feminist press, Eighth Mountain Press. So it was it's interesting, I'm sort of going through some of my files and I found these folders loaded with reviews from various women's presses around the country and so on in a way that is impossible now. Like with Wesleyan, it's much more difficult to get reviewed right now for me than it was then. It was quite a movement in terms of literature. I mean, probably some of you know Audre Lorde, people like that were, you know, a poet like that, Joelle Gomez, Gloria Anzaldúa. These became major writers in the American landscape, and they all started with feminist presses. It was very influential and wonderful for me. I mean, I feel like I came out relatively late. I was 33 when I first came out. But it was like perfect. I was in the perfect place. I was very, very lucky that I was in New York City and I bumped into literally the right people, and it happened. It was there, and it was partly enabled me to immediately engage. I was very secretive about my writing. I didn't tell people, I didn't show my work. But I had immediately a community that I could engage with and that I could relate to. And that fed me, you know, and that supported me and encouraged me. And I mean, it's very important for writers to feel wanted. And instead of just, you know, I mean, I know there's this image of the writer writing alone in a secret attic or whatever, whatever kind of silly thing. But it's wonderful when you have that engagement and people sort of value you and support it in a way that, you know, our regular society doesn't really support it. So it was it was life-changing for me. And I wasn't an activist until I really came out. I wasn't involved very much. I mean, I needed to lose my job, which I did. I lost my only full-time teaching job at LIU. I was a budgetary cut at a time of recession. And I came out, and the movement was beginning. It was beginning with an explosion. I mean, I came out about 4 years after Stonewall. So it was in New York, I was lucky I was in New York and not in some small town. You know, it was so I consider myself very, very fortunate and very indebted to that movement. I never would have guessed, I never would have thought a university press would ever publish anything of mine, ever. I mean, it was like this big surprise.
Well, I still consider you a dangerous writer, even if you're published by a university press. So let's, I think if we could move to the final cluster of poems now.
So I thought I'd save some of the, I know some of you are interested in Yiddish, and I thought I'd sort of save some of the poems with Yiddish too. So I'm going to begin with the poem about Fradl Stock. I sort of take on her voice. Fradl Stock interested me because she was very unique in the sense that she actually tried to write in two languages, in both languages. When she arrived, she was already a sort of young, but already quite known poet, Yiddish poet. But after coming here, she actually wrote a complete whole novel called, I think it's called For Musicians Only. And actually wasn't a great novel. I've read it. But in any case, it was interesting to me that she was the only writer, Yiddish writer that's known who had actually tried to write in English, to switch languages, because it's one of the hardest things, I think, the switch in languages for a writer who's already written something, to be in exile and to be in a society where they don't hear their natural language. It's a question of how do you keep up your own language, or how do you switch languages? So it's a kind of dilemma. So I wrote this poem in her voice. She was, at the time that I wrote it, it was assumed she had died in a mental institution. And I wrote the poem with that in mind. That turned out to be false, so you shouldn't take the whole poem is a fabrication to begin with, so this is part of the fabrication, I guess. And the poem has the epigram from Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet. When he was in exile here in the States, he wrote, "Language is the only homeland." So this is Fradl, my imagination, Fradl Stock speaking. They make it sound easy, some disjointed sentences, a few allusions to mankind. But for me, it was not so simple, more like trying to cover the distance from here to the corner or between two sounds. I tried. I did try. First held with Yiddish, but you know, it's hard. You write Gas and street echoes back. No resonance. And let's face it, memory falters. You try to keep track of the difference, the Gott, like Gott and God, or Heus and house, but they blur, and you start using alley when you mean Gesela, or avenue when it's a boulevard. And before you know it, you're on some alien path standing before a brick house, the house door frame slightly familiar. Still, you can't replace it exactly. Passers-by stop, concerned, they speak, but you've heard all this before, the vowels shifting up and down, the subtle change in the guttural sounds, and now it's nothing more than babble. And so you accept it, you're lost. This time, you really don't know where you are. Land or sea, the house floats before you. Perhaps you once sat at that window and it was home and looked out on that street or Gesela. Perhaps it was a dead end, perhaps a shortcut, perhaps not. A movement by the door. They stand there beckoning, mouths open and close. Come in, come in. I understood it was a welcome. A dank, I said, till I heard the lock snap behind me. This is another poem. This is a poem, again, about my mother. And I wrote it after I read, I don't know how many people have read Chaim Grade's memoir. It's both in Yiddish and the Yiddish has been translated into English, called My Mother's Sabbath Days. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's gorgeous. It's just a wonderful, wonderful memoir. And he writes a great deal there about his mother, Vela Grade, who was a very poor widow, living like in a basement, trying to support this son by selling apples in the street, a totally hopeless situation. And I started thinking about my mother. My mother ended up being an archivist, but before she was an archivist, she was a seamstress. And one of the periods of being a seamstress, she worked for a fashion designer in Manhattan. We lived in the Bronx, and she was in Manhattan, and the fashion designer, Miss Kant. And so it was very kind of glamorous, sort of. And this is about her, and it's called Domama Shabbosim, My Mother's Sabbath Days. I was kind of feeling kind of competitive and sort of wanted to do what Grada did, but the problem was, of course, that we were not observant. I mean, we were Velchlach Yidden, so we didn't have Shabbos, but I still wanted to do this. And so this is my version of My Mother's Sabbath Days, called Domama Shabbosim, inspired by Vela Grada. Bei uns ist es gewesen anders. I knew nothing of the 613 mitzvahs which did not bind me, nor of the 3 which did, though I'm sure my grandmother, Rikla Perchikov, knew them all, and I have a vague image of her covering her eyes and swaying. Shoshana, Rushka, Loja, Mama Law, and more recently Rose, in short, my mother, and all her reincarnations did not pass on such things. She'd given them up even before she'd ever claimed them. She was more modern. And besides, there were other matters to teach. So by age 11, bin schon gewesen a brennendicke Sozialistke. I was a passionate socialist, impatient, so impatient to grow into my knowledge, never guessing there was no choice, for work and rest wrestled in every human life, with work inevitably the unbeatable winner. So for us, it was different. Erev Shabbos was plain Freitag, or more precisely, Piontek. I remember summer evenings I wait for her at the Mashalu stop of the Lexington line, bright heat and light at 6 o'clock. She was full of tales of Miss Kant, the designer, a career woman longing for home and family, in love with a handsome pilot, of Scotty, the model who married smart, a wealthy buyer and now sat brazenly chic in a reform synagogue. I listened eager to understand these widow tales of romance amid the rush of each season's showing, and once even saw on the page of the Times a mannequin dressed in the very gown Mama Law had made. All the way up Jerome Avenue, we'd walk past the Jewish deli where we never ate. What was the point if you could make it at home? Past the pizza place where occasionally while shopping, she'd buy me a slice. Past the outdoor groceries, fruit stands, fabric, shoes, lingerie, and stationery stores, till Golden Hill Road and Jade Gardens. Perhaps I knew it was treif. She certainly did, but was not concerned. We'd order the salty wonton soup, chow mein, or pepper steak, and though she mocked the food, she never resisted. It was Friday. The shop was closed. We'd eat dinner and, like the rich, lean leisurely back in our booth. I didn't know it was Erev Shabbos. Still, she rested. This is the first poem I tried to write bilingually, and it's called Et Lechaverta Oif Mama Lashon, a few words in the mother tongue. Et Lechaverta Oif Mama Lashon, a few words in the mother tongue. Lamoshel, for example, Di Yidina. Oh, sorry, jump by. Lamoshel, for example, Di Kurva, the whore, a woman who acknowledges her passions. The Yidina, the Jewish woman, ignorant, overbearing. Let's face it, every woman is one. The Yenta, the gossip, the busybody who knows what's what and is never caught off guard. The Lesbianka, the one with a roommate, though we never used the word. Das Weibel, the wife, or the little woman. in the Heim, at home, where she does everything to keep Yiddishkeit alive. Yiddishkeit, a way of being Jewish, always arguable. In Mark, where she buys die Kartoffel and challah, yes, potatoes and challah, die Kartoffel, the material counterpart of Yiddishkeit. With Sibboleth, with onions that bring Tränen to the Augen, tears to her eyes, when she sees how little it all is. Weniger und weniger, less and less. Die Challah, braided via Hall Vater Hasana, like her hair before the wedding when she was Azashain Mädel, such a pretty girl. Die lange schwarze Haar, the long black hair, die lange schwarze Haar. A Frau träumt, a woman dreams ihr Ort auf der Welt, her place in this world, and sie hat Moira, and she is afraid, so afraid of the words Kurva, Yidna, Yenta, Lesbianka, Weibel. Sie träumt, she dreams, und sie hat Moira, and she is afraid, ihr Ort, die Welt, die Heim, der Mark. A Mädel Holland, a Kurve Holland, a Yidena Holland, a Yenta Holland, a Lesbianke Holland, a Weibel Holland, die Kartoffel, die Challah, Yiddishkeit, sie Holland, die Haar, die lange schwarze Haar, sie Holland, sie Holland, sie Holland. And the last poem I'll read is a more recent one. It goes back, perhaps you'll recognize the theme, I think. It's called De Fremde in der Fremd. Gedenkst, do you remember when you were a stranger among strangers? A Fremde on Papieren, a stranger without papers? Gedenkst die Frages, those endless questions. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer seinen gewinn eure Schreinem? Who were your neighbors? Where was the school? What work did you do? What can you do here that you couldn't do there? Noch einmal, for the third, fourth, fifth time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Wer's der Mann? Wer's die Frau? Who is this man? Who is this woman? Und die Papieren and their papers, und das Kind and this child, did you find it here or bring it from there? Do you have a passport for him, for her, for ein Kind, that one with the dark hair? Noch einmal, for the 10th, 11th, 12th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here and not there? Who did you know here? Who did you know there? Where will you sleep here? How did you sleep there? Und eure Chaläumes, what did you dream of here? What did you dream of there? Where will you work here? What work did you do there? And why can't you just work there? Wo ist die Visa, die grüne Karte, der Passport? Visa, green card, passport, photo from here and from there. And why did you cut your hair? Und das Kind, why did you bring this child here and not leave it there? Noch einmal, for the 18th, 19th, 20th time. Wer seid ihr? Von wannen kommt ihr? Für wo seid ihr da und nicht geblieben dorten? Why are you here? And why didn't you just stay there?
Those are beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask a question, but I do want to ask folks in the audience to submit if any questions that they have. Now is the time. So the scholar Zohar Wyman-Kelman devotes an entire chapter of their book, Queer Encounters, the Genealogy of Jewish Women's Poetry, to your work. And they talk of two of the poems that you just read, Friedelstock and Some Words in the Mother Tongue, as, in quotes, queering both translation and transmission offering translation as a mode of queer transmission. And I'm curious about whether you made these connections between Yiddish and queerness at the time of writing, and how you feel about the resonance that Yiddish has for many LGBTQ Jews.
Well, the last part is how I feel about it. I think it's great. So I think it's wonderful. I mean, I don't, these things, when you do these things at the time that you're doing it, you're not on a mission. You're wanting to write a poem. That's sort of where you're at. You want to write a poem, and what's going to happen with that poem, or what that poem means, or whatever, you just don't really know. I don't think, I think you certainly don't know what kind of resonance it's going to have for other people, either just during that time or later on, so, and people see things that you don't see in it, or you don't, I didn't write this to start a movement. I just wrote it because I wanted to include I wanted to see what I could do with Yiddish. In what way could I use it? Because like I say, I've never been a fluent Yiddish speaker. And so I feel that the only way I could do it is in a fragmented kind of way, but to make it very meaningful. And I was very conscious of sort of what I thought was really the denigration of Yiddish on television with these comics. And, it was always kind of a joke. Not that I don't think Yiddish can be funny, but it was always kind of, and usually it was a dirty joke of some sort. And I thought it was like, I wanted it to be different, but I also didn't want to romanticize it. And that was one of the things. I mean, I'm not nostalgic, I don't think. And that's why Lesbianka is there. And that's why Yenta, I mean, all these derogatory, I mean, on the one hand, it's reclaiming Yiddish. On the other hand, I'm using all the derogatory terms, so I didn't, and that was supposed to be the antidote to the nostalgia for me. Yes, I want to embrace Yiddish, but I don't want to be dopey about it and pretend like it was Gan Eden, like it was Eden, when it wasn't. Women had a hard time in the Yiddish speaking world, as women do all around the world, no matter what language they're speaking. So I don't know. I mean, I think it did have resonance in ways that I certainly never anticipated. I mean, and I can't speak for scholars. I mean, she's always a good friend, and I don't even read what she writes about me. I don't, not very much, but so I don't really have an answer for you. I certainly am very, I mean, I think one of the things that happened was, and I know this is a kind of touchy subject, but there were people that were desperately wanted to identify as Jews, and they were not religious, and they were not Zionists. And they needed to latch on to something. And I think hanging on to something like the Jewish Labor Bund or Yiddish in a certain way was a way to become rooted in something that they felt comfortable with. And I think Yiddish became, for a lot of people, a kind of queer, an otherness, an embrace of an otherness from a kind of mainstream American Jewish, or let me say, from a Jewish American mainstream, which is more observant, more Zionist, and certainly more Hebrew oriented than there would be about Yiddish. Yiddish was sort of the stepchild at this point. So from that point of view, it's not surprising that a lot of gays moved in that direction. To me, I mean, in Kless Camp, I don't know how many people remember Kless Camp in the 90s. Kless Camp, I remember one time there was a meal and somebody wanted to take a photograph of the gay people. I don't know, they wanted a gay photograph or something. And during this meal, they said, everybody who's gay, go into a corner, go step over there, we're going to take a photograph. And half the dining room got up, and like we were just flabbergasted because we didn't even realize, And it was a wonderful kind of embracing of both queer, observant, non-observant, Zionist, non-Zionist. Kless Camp was very wonderful in that way. It was very there was no tension. If people wanted to observe Shabbos, they did. If they didn't have to. I mean, it was very, very wonderful, but it was really a lot of gays there at the time. I'm talking about now in the 90s. So when it was still much fresher than it is, the whole movement was really, and the charismatics were just coming up. and, producing their, very queer material, basically. So, yes, I'm glad that I'm in any way associated with that. And, but I don't think any of us really thought that it was going to turn out to be what it has turned out to be, which is quite wonderful.
Thank you. So Rena Fisher asks if you can speak about the dedication portion of Basheret. She says, she writes, I always send people to it, as for me, it uniquely captures one reality of the Khurban, an often arbitrary line between the few who lived and those who died.
Yeah, I mean, the Bashert is a very long autobiographical poem that focuses on 4 moments in my life where I sort of encounter something that happens, maybe Bashert or not. And I wrote the dedications. There are 2 dedications. They're called these words are dedicated to those who died, and these words are dedicated to those who survived. 2 different sort of lists. And they overlap. A lot of the reasons that people died are the reasons, or that they didn't die are the reasons that some people did die, the same reason, because it's a very irrational kind of thing. It's an interesting, I know it captured a lot of, got a lot of attention. It's interesting to me. The poem was originally published in lesbian magazine called Sinister Wisdom, the whole thing, the dedications and the body of the poem. And during the 80s, I got many requests, not for Jewish rituals, but for memorials and commemorations for men who had died of AIDS, that they used those 2 dedications, those who survived and those who died, for though they wanted permission to be able to use those dedications. So I think there is, if you really look at it closely, I wrote the dedications after I wrote the entire poem. It was the last thing I did for the poem. And if you look at it very closely, there's really no necessarily Holocaust direct reference in it. And I wanted it to be broader, but it's been embraced, and I'm very honored. And in fact, one of the people here, Gabby von Seltman, if you go and look up Irena Klepfisz Bashert, you will see a video that she made, a 4-minute video of me reciting that poem, or the dedications rather, with a visual that she created. So it's, I'm always stunned at how many people know that. I didn't happen to read it this time. I don't know whether I should have or not. I sort of worry it's sort of over, it's gonna be over, I don't know, overread, over whatever, something over. So yeah, it's to me, I'm very glad that it's been embraced in different ways, that the meaning of that survival and death, and that it's very precarious in very different kinds of situations, not only in the Holocaust. Hi, Rena, I haven't seen you in forever years, Rena Fisher. I remember you.
Thanks. So this is, I think, will be our last question. Diana and Joel ask whether there are gay Jewish poets still active in speaking out against Israel's rightward lurch.
And Israel's what?
Rightward direction.
You mean
to the political right, yeah.
Oh, say it again. I'm sorry, Howard. I'm not getting this
Sure.
right.
Are gay Jewish poets still active in speaking out against Israel's rightward lurch?
Oh, a rightward, yeah, I think I would imagine so. I mean, most of the people I know are speaking out. I think the issue is not whether Jewish poets are speaking out, but whether the Jewish institutions are speaking out, and whether the leaders of those institutions and whether our representatives are speaking out, because I mean, they're, so I would imagine they are. I don't know who specifically you're sort of thinking about, but most of the people that I know, poets or not, a lot of the Jews that I know are extremely, very, very worried about what's happening over there right now.
Okay. So
I'm very anything.
Thank you. Okay, so this has just been really so special and such a important for me personally. This has just been such a pleasure to be in your presence, and I want to put in a major pitch for this book, which I just love. This is the collection that she all the poems she read, and as well as Basheret and other longer poem cycles. They're all in the book. And it's such a wonderful collection. I want to thank all of our co-presenting organizations. And I'm going to put a link now into the chat for the Yiddish Theater Ensemble's upcoming presentation of a play that will be based on Irena's work. And so click on that for more information. And we'll also send an email to everybody tomorrow with a list of all of her works. And I encourage you to explore them, but it's been such a pleasure to hear you read them, which just enhances them so greatly. So
thank you so much for having me, Howard. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Okay, be well, everybody. Be healthy, and all the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.